poet Eminem once wrote, "You only got one shot, do not miss your chance to blow. This opportunity comes once in a lifetime, yo." I immediately regret it.
I've made a huge mistake.
Anyhow, this phrase is applicable to Dynasty because that's how I think a lot of people feel about their first round pick when they have a contending team. You probably only have one first round pick on most of your Dynasty teams. It's probably your own first round pick. When do you cash in that chip to try and take your team to the next level? That's what we're going to talk about in today's Dynasty 101 video.
What? What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
All right. So you're sitting there, you're looking at your team. Maybe you're 3-0 and you're thinking, this is the year that I make the super team. Maybe you're 1-2 thinking, I was supposed to contend this year. What happened? How do I fix this? What are the right scenarios where you want to trade your first round pick? What are the scenarios where you want to keep it? Who are the right targets? Why is this decision important? We're going to cover all that today in the next few minutes. So let's start at square one. Why is this such a crucial decision point? And the reason for that is because the first round pick is uniquely scarce and it's uniquely universal in its appeal to other managers. So think back to the first Dynasty 101 video that we ever did, and I talked about the three types of currency in Dynasty leagues. We have productive value, right? That's current year projected production. We have what I call EYR value, which is basically future production of current players. And then you have picks. When you look at each team in your league, they're going to, of course, evaluate these currencies differently. If you're a contending team, productive value is very important to you. To an extent, EYR value is important to you if it comes with a player who's also currently productive, like a younger player like a Rashee Rice, for instance, or Malik Neighbors would be like the best possible example of this. And then, of course, you have pick value, which has a certain level of appeal to everybody, but probably going to be the most important portion of a rebuilding team or a team that's trying to tank right now and rebuild.
Hey guys, look, we don't want to win. So here's a list of all the pitches I'm going to throw in order.
When you think about how this value is going to appeal to certain teams, it's important to think about not just the universality of that type of currency, but of the very specific asset. If you have Ladd McConkey, for example, Ladd McConkey is a piece as a young first-year wide receiver that should be, in theory, appealing to teams that might be rebuilding. But these teams aren't just computer programmers. You can't just punch it in to keep trade cut. As I always say, your league mates are not an ATM. Some people in your league, probably pretty big fans of Ladd McConkey. Some people, probably not. Whether Ladd McConkey is going to be a helpful trade asset to you really depends on who the manager is that you're trading them for and what they think of Ladd McConkey. That's not really the case with a first. I understand that in a vacuum, every dynasty manager is going to value picks a little bit differently, but when it comes down to it, if a team has decided that they're going to be selling off points and building towards the future, there's only so many things you can do, and usually what they're going to probably do is trade points for picks. And they're going to want picks, they're going to want your picks, they're going to want everybody's picks. And so when you have one first round pick, this is your one chance to be able to send out a universally appealing asset that any player who's willing to sell production is going to be targeting and is going to want on their team. And that's why it's so important. So from a very baseline perspective, what I think is crucial for people to understand is that you probably want to sell your first round pick actually at a little bit higher value than I would say that it's worth. Because again, you only get to do this move once. So it's not a matter of, is the player I'm getting slightly more valuable to me than the first round pick I'm sending? It's, is this the best possible deal that I'm going to get at any time this year in terms of adding to the expected value of my team using my first round pick? I think you have to be especially careful, specifically cashing in the pick for that reason. Let's get into part two, which is what types of teams should you be trying to move your first round pick on? What teams would I not be trying to do that? So I would look at these as three different types of contenders, and really one of them is the one where I'd be most inclined to move my pick. The first is, and it's like I talked about before with the inventory episode, is that kind of dynasty level team, right? The team where everything is great. You have one of the highest points scored in your league. You're probably in first place. You're probably going to get a bye. This is a team where I'm actually not trying to move my first round pick. Why is that? Because most of the expected value of the current year of your team just comes down to whether you get a bye. Teams that are higher seeded in Dynasty win about 56% of playoff matchups. So that's like a weighted coin flip. Maybe you make your team extra special and you get that up to 60, maybe even 65. It's pretty hard to get above that in an average matchup. Which means that once you have a bye, you've kind of already done all you can do to maximize the expected value of your team this year. And the more important thing to deal with is, how do I try to maximize the expected value of my team over time? How do I extend my contending window beyond this year? And that's where the first round pick becomes very valuable. If I already have one of the most productive teams this year, I would rather have my first round pick that I could potentially use to extend my contending window than a player like a Tyreek Hill, for example, or a Devontae Adams, or Mike Evans, or one of these older players that might help this year, but I've already have a high expected value this year. I want more value into the future. Another one of these types of teams that you might consider is the sort of disappointing contender. This is the team where you plan to contend this year. It's not quite going as planned, and you're starting to panic a little bit. What if we try to get a big boost in there before it's too late? This is, again, probably not where I'd want to trade the first round pick, and that's just because of the value spread of the asset. That first example where we talked about the team with the bye, your first round pick can really only be as bad as like 9th because you're going to get a bye, and it can only be as good as 12th. So that's not, it's certainly a very valuable asset, but it's not going to be extremely risky to trade away in the same way it is in this scenario, where if you trade your first round pick and then you suffer another big injury, you don't make the playoffs, you might have just traded away a first round pick that's actually worth like 1.5 or 1.75 base ones of value because all of a sudden it's the 103, it's the 104, right? Think about if you had traded a first round pick last year off of one of these types of teams and it ends up being the 104, and now you've just traded away like Jaden Daniels or Malik Neighbors, right? That probably is not feeling very great right now. So on these teams, to me, I'm not saying you necessarily have to start tearing down immediately. It's only been 3 weeks. But I think the guys you have in the locker room probably need to figure it out themselves. And if they don't, then you might wind up just reloading with this team into another year. But I wouldn't want to spend good money after bad. So would I ever trade my first round pick? The answer to that is yes. Here's the types of teams where I'd be most inclined to do it. The team where I'd be most inclined to trade my first round pick is if there's a trade I can make that takes me from a good bet to be one of the 3 to 6 teams in the playoffs, so like seeds 3 through 6, into one of the bye teams in the playoffs. That's why I actually think now is a better time to trade your first round pick than at the deadline as well, because you have a longer time period for this to really matter, where not only are you giving yourself a playoff boost, but you're giving yourself a real chance for this player to create value above replacement all season long and hopefully lead you to a bye. So that's going to be really important. The other nice thing with these types of teams is that you want to make sure that you're trading your first round pick from a team that has a high buying power, right? You want to be robust where you're not making sure locking in that this is your last year of contention by moving your first round pick, right? You hopefully have enough insulation in your team that you can withstand losing your first round pick this year and can keep that train rolling. Another couple of teams where I might move my first round pick, and these are probably more case specific rather than universal, would be teams that are actually these lower value contenders, but they're really high in production. So maybe you have a team that's like first in points, but like 8th in buying power. And you've already kind of seen like, no matter what I do, I'm rebuilding next year. This is the last stand. At that point, I suppose you may as well cash in the chips. And then you're probably not losing that much expected value if, again, you can push your team from potentially not getting a bye to more likely to getting a bye. That's always going to be the most important factor. And then the last exception would be a high value team that has a lot of injuries. So maybe you're at the top or near the very top of the league in buying power, but you're kind of middling on production. And one of the reasons you're middling on production is because of injuries, right? At that point, it goes back to what I said in previous videos. If you have one of the highest value teams in the league, you should always be trying to compete. I wouldn't necessarily want to sell low on my injured players, like for instance, like a Puka Nacua. So maybe instead you kind of use Puka Nacua. You say, you coming back to my team, that's my first round pick. And my actual first round pick I'm going to move for production that's going to help me in the meantime. And then when Puka comes back and this new player I've just bought, all of a sudden I'm going to have this absolute juggernaut. So those are the kind of teams where I would potentially move my first round pick. Just to recap, the most common would be a high value contender that's currently in the middle of the playoff hunt, but I can push him towards a buy team. And then the more limited exceptions would be a low value contender that you're rebuilding next year no matter what anyway, right? Not a team you're pushing towards rebuilding by doing this. You're rebuilding it next year anyway. This is the last stand. Fine. Go first round pick. Go get a buy. Let's win the title this year. Flags fly forever. And then that third team is the high value team that's struggling in points, but you want to make sure that you're locking in a playoff spot, ideally a buy spot, and you just have a lot of injuries. And so you're willing to trade the first round pick because you're kind of treating your injured assets as that value influx that's going to help you on later, potentially next season. What type of players should you be targeting? The first rule is you should be targeting managers and not players, right? It shouldn't be, I want to buy this guy and now I'm going to send a big offer until the guy says accept. That's not the ideal way to play Dynasty. Ideally, you're going to whatever managers are willing to sell. And there's probably a couple managers in your league that like were already tanking at the start of the season. Maybe not the best targets because they probably don't have that many players that are going to be super productive they're looking to trade away. But there might be a couple. The best managers to target would be if someone started 0-3, if someone started 1-2, and they actually already had kind of a contender-ish roster coming into the year, and maybe it's just disappointed. You send them a text, say, hey, what are you looking to do with your team, right? And don't be rude about it. Don't be like, your team sucks. You're not going to contend. You got to give me your players. Don't do that. Say like, hey, what are you looking at doing this year? And you might get an answer that says like, I don't know, man. I kind of thought I'd be contending, but it's not going as I thought. I might need to sell off. Then you say, hey, look, is Mike Evans available? Is Tyreek Hill available? Whoever they have that's interesting. Hey, I could be a buyer for you. And then you try to figure out the value. Ideally, if you're trading a first, you of course want it to line up in terms of market value. So you can use sources like Dynasty Data Lab, Keep Trade Cut, anything like that, my rankings if you want to, on Thinking Above Thinking, to have the appropriate market value. But you want to make sure that you're getting a legitimate value over replacement addition. You don't really want to just be trading for depth. So if I'm trading my first round pick, I don't want to do trading my first round pick and I'm getting two guys that are kind of worth a second. I want to be trading the first and I want to be getting Tyreek Hill. I want to be trading the first and maybe even adding and getting a true superstar like an Amon-Ra St. Brown, or Rashee Rice, something like that. You want to make sure that you're really maximizing the value over replacement of your lineup. And so ideally, if you have like kind of a deep flat lineup where it's just like a lot of startable guys but no true superstars, those are probably better spots where you want to make a consolidation trade of see if you can move two players for one player rather than just moving the first and then sliding everybody else down. The best spot where you're targeting your first is you have a hole in your roster and you can fill that from like a sub-replacement level player to an elite player. You use your first to do that. That's going to maximize the value of the trade. All right, that was a lot today. So let's do a quick recap. Number one, be very careful when you're trading your first round pick in Dynasty. It's a very singular asset. It has universal appeal, and it's a scarce resource. You probably only have one. Number two, make sure that you're picking the right type of team to trade your first. That means looking for teams where you have a big chance to increase the value of a replacement in your lineup. You're filling a real hole in your lineup. And you're ideally trying to turn borderline playoff teams into buy teams. You're not trying to squeak into the playoffs, and you're not trying to build the super team when you already have a buy locked up. Those are less efficient forms of value. And most of all, you want to make sure that it's case specific. You want to make sure that it's team specific. Evaluate your roster, evaluate your league, make it fair market value, make it have the biggest impact that it can. These are the types of things to consider when trading your first round pick in Dynasty. I will see you soon for another Dynasty 101 video.